Okay, hi guys. Let's see who's all here. All right, just in terms of the overview of the rest of this week, let's look at the syllabus. So tomorrow will be the second half of the Adam Smith readings, and the sections that we're reading that are listed in the announcement and also in the syllabus are on colonization and public expenses. There's some discussion of infrastructure spending, but a lot of the discussion is on education. So that will be for tomorrow night. Thursday night, we'll be talking about Immanuel Kant and Benjamin Constant's views on modern bourgeois society. So we'll read two essays by Kant, What is Enlightenment, and the Idea for Universal History from a Cosmopolitan Point of View, and then Benjamin Constant's The Liberty of the Ancients Compared to That of the Moderns. Kant will be writing after the American Revolution, before the French Revolution. Constant will be writing after the French Revolution, after the fall of Napoleon in the early 1800s. So the last reading that we will have on bourgeois society and on the kind of pre-Marxian readings will be Hegel's for Monday, July 21st, the Introduction to the Philosophy of History. And then we'll get into the Marx for Tuesday and Thursday of next week. All right. So, in terms of Adam Smith, I wanted to just recall something that I mentioned previously, which is that Adam Smith is among the earliest appreciators of Rousseau in the English-speaking world, in the Anglophone world. So he is part of what's known as the Scottish Enlightenment. Another figure of the Scottish Enlightenment is David Hume, who's an important philosopher. He's associated with empiricism in philosophy. A lot of this we won't have to get too far into the weeds on, but Kant, who we'll be dealing with later this week, also influenced by Rousseau, is also trying to respond to what he calls Humean skepticism. But we'll get into that when we discuss the Kant on Thursday. So Hume and Smith are friends, but also they're acquaintances of Rousseau. So they give Rousseau shelter in the UK briefly. Rousseau was fleeing creditors that he owed money to, baby mamas, that he didn't recognize the children that he had with, and political authorities. Anyway, when they met Rousseau, and Hume in particular, Hume wrote a letter to Adam Smith, and he said, Rousseau might be brilliant, but he's kind of an asshole. And Smith is like, yeah, but he might be an asshole, but he's a genius. Right. Now, when Rousseau then left England and went back to the continent, he condemned the British for being too commercially minded, too mercantile in their outlook. So he didn't condemn Hume and Smith particularly, but he did condemn British society. Now, I mention all of this because, in fact, what we know now as the French Enlightenment, we generally know the Enlightenment through the French. we tend to neglect the Scottish Enlightenment and the kind of earlier Enlightenment. But the so-called French Enlightenment, but really continental Enlightenment thinkers, are Anglophiles. They're Anglophiles. Something that we'll talk about on Thursday when we read Benjamin Constant in particular, but also Kant. Meaning one of the inspirations for the French Revolution in 1789 is the 100th anniversary of the Glorious Revolution in England that established the constitutional monarchy. So part of what's motivating the French Revolution in 1789 is that they want the same responsible government responsible to the people, that the English had had for 100 years already. So the Scottish Enlightenment is influential, and the more broad British Enlightenment is influential on the Continental Enlightenment, on the French Enlightenment that comes later. John Locke, who I think that I've already mentioned when we were talking about the social contract, he is a very important philosopher, also in terms of empiricism, development of empiricism, and political thinker. So I think that I mentioned that he established in political thought the three inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property, and that he tied property to labor. That's going to be important when we do Marx next week. It will be very important early in our readings from Marx. The whole question of property and labor, and where does property come from? Okay, so Smith, again, influenced by Rousseau, he comments in the Edinburgh Review where he translates long passages from the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality after it's published. He says that Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, shows that there are people on the continent who are thinking our way, who are thinking along the same lines we are, over here in the British Enlightenment and in the Scottish Enlightenment in particular. And in many respects, we could say that Smith is trying to elaborate Rousseau. So let's think about how he might be doing so. So if Smith's associated with the idea of the invisible hand guiding society, it's actually not a phrase of his. It's not original to him. It actually comes from another writer, another English writer, Bernard Mandeville, in a writing called The Fable of the Bees. That, however, is influential on Rousseau, first of all, and then again influential on Smith in thinking about the general will of society. So what would it mean to conceive of labor, production, wealth as the general will of society? This is what we're reading on The Wealth of Nations is the second major work by Adam Smith. His first major work was called The Theory of the Moral Sentiments. And he actually considered it to be his more important book and his more foundational book, published before On the Wealth of Nations. Smith was not an economist. He was a moral philosopher. And On the Wealth of Nations is a work of political economy, which we'll see what Marx says about political economy. Political economy is not economics. It's a subset of moral philosophy, and it really, today, we would think of it more as social theory, or even as sociology. So it's about the politics of the economy and the economy of the polis. You know, we talked about that term, the polis, the zoon politikon, the Aristotelian idea that humans are the political animal, that among the social animals, humans are distinguished as the political animal. Okay, so now getting back to the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality and the two components of reason, that Rousseau laid out: pity and perfectibility, or empathy and adaptability. And adaptability not only to physical and biological nature, to the environment, but adaptability also to second nature, society. So pity and perfectibility, empathy and adaptability. In many respects, the theory of the moral sentiments by Smith, his first work, is about pity. It's about empathy. And this work on the Wealth of Nations is broadly exploring a key aspect of human adaptability, perfectibility. When we looked at the passage from Marx from the Grundrisse on becoming on the first day of class, Marx talked about wealth being the aim of production. And he said, well, what is wealth? Wealth is the universality of human capacities and enjoyments developed through universal exchange, and with no previously established yardstick and no inherent limitation or condition other than antecedent historical evolution. That's the way he described it. So wealth is our capacity to produce our means of survival, and also to produce ourselves. So I think Marx describes it as bringing out all that is latent in terms of human potentiality, that it's elaborated through production, through self-production, the aim of that being wealth, and wealth itself being the capacity for production. So one key thing that we're having to think about with Smith on the Wealth of Nations, what is wealth? Wealth is not tangible goods, it's not physical things. It's our capacity to produce. So the true measure of wealth is our capacity to produce through our labor. So some of the background, he gets into it in terms of one school of political economy that he's arguing against, and also one kind of frame of mind that isn't really a school of political economy. The first is the physiocrats, who do think that wealth is based on physical things, on natural resources, on the land, and on population. He's arguing against that. We'll see how. Also against what he calls the mercantile interest, or what we now call mercantilism, which is again more of a mindset and a kind of disposition rather than like an actual school of thought. What's the immediate background for Smith's on the Wealth of Nations? So he's publishing in 1776, which is serendipitously the year that the North American English colonies declare independence. The Revolutionary War had already begun, but the American Revolution is conventionally dated to 1776. And we'll see in the reading for tomorrow what he has to say about the American colonies and their discontents, and the management of the colonies, the policy of the British towards the colonies. He's going to have two counter examples there, the American example and India as an example. And he's going to counterpose British policy and the results of British policy in those two places. He's going to be very critical of British colonial policy in both places. He's especially known at this time as a critic of the East India Company, which is the state-organized monopoly on trade that the British have with India. He's very critical of that. He actually makes a speech in Parliament against the East India Company and in favor of abolishing it. The greater historical background for On the Wealth of Nations is what's known as the 7 Years' War. In American history, it's known as the French and Indian War. It's the war between the British and the French in the middle of the 1700s, in which the British prevailed over the French. And it's really a world war. It's a war that's fought in North America, in Africa, in India, in the Caribbean, and also continentally in Europe. The British win even though they have a lower population and smaller land mass overall in terms of their home country, the metropolitan country, and their colonial possessions. So the French have greater population and greater natural resources, and yet the British win, and the British win largely for economic reasons. Now, this 7 Years' War is also the immediate background for the American Revolution. So it initiates a cycle that culminates in the French Revolution and the full cycle of the French Revolution, including the Napoleonic Wars. So it's a kind of a long contest between the British and the French, in which the British come out on top initially, but the French contest British supremacy until the British finally vanquish the French when they defeat Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815. Okay, so the taxes that are levied on the colonies in North America by the British that provoke the American Revolution. No taxation without representation. Those taxes are meant to repay the British government for their costs of the war against the French. So it's meant for the colonies to pay back the British for their protection in the so-called French and Indian War. It's also the time when the British acquire Canada, including Quebec, the French-speaking part of Canada. Now, the Americans revolt against the British taxes. The French try to get revenge on the British by supporting the American Revolution. The French bankrupt themselves supporting the American Revolution, and that leads to the French Revolution. So it's a wonderful cycle that unfolds. The head of the military mission by the French to aid the American revolutionaries in the war against the British is Count Lafayette, and Lafayette is one of the leaders of the French Revolution. And one of his officers is Saint-Simon, who later, so he's a very young man when he serves in the French military during the American Revolution. He's later one of the central utopian socialists of the early 1800s. Lafayette is one of the three authors of the Declaration of the Rights of Human Being and Citizen in the French Revolution. The other two authors are Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson is the ambassador, so he's there in France when the revolution is breaking out, and a guy known as the Abbé Sieyès, who writes the main revolutionary pamphlet of the French Revolution called What is the Third Estate?, where he talks about the commoners rising up and creating a society based on labor. That will be the new principle of society once the church and the aristocracy are overthrown. Okay, so Smith is in the midst of all of this history. I should also say that Smith, he's influenced by Rousseau, and Rousseau influences Kant and Hegel, who we'll be reading later. But also Smith is very important for Kant and Hegel. He's extremely important for Kant and also for Hegel, both for his theory of moral sentiments and his Wealth of Nations and other writings of his. So again, Smith, in our time, he's known as an economist. He's not an economist. He's a moral philosopher, and political economy is a subset of moral philosophy. And political economy is really what we would now call social theory. It's not economics. Because it's really about the relationship of politics and economics. It's really about social relations, something that we've already mentioned. Social relations, something that we're going to get into today. So labor, not just as a physical activity, but as a social relation. Now, on the first day of class, we looked also at the dialectic of being and becoming, the dialectic of what is and what ought to be, or we will see on Monday with Hegel, the dialectic of nature and spirit. Part of what's going on in a work like The Wealth of Nations is that Smith is not just describing the way things are, but he's describing the way they ought to be. So Smith, in our time, in the last 50 years, and maybe a little bit longer than that, in the era of neoliberalism, he's been raised as this kind of champion of free market economics. That's a massive distortion of Smith. What they do is that they selectively appropriate Smith as a kind of capitalist ideology, and they nonetheless gut him of his central idea, which is what we're going to be discussing tonight. What's also associated with Marx, the so-called labor theory of value. So what you'll hear from people is that, well, Smith, he's good on like markets and supply and demand, but the labor theory of value, no, that's not right. Now, in fact, he's not a supply and demand market guy. That's what he's going to call the mercantile interest. He's actually arguing against that. He's arguing against value being based on market supply and demand. Rather, he's saying value should be that it is, in a potential latent sense, but it should be recognized as and fully realized as based on labor. So value should not be based on supply and demand, even though it is, due to market phenomena, market exchange, but in fact, in a more abiding way over a longer period of time, and also in a way that should be more fully realized and therefore recognized better and really pursued, it should be the basis of value. Value of what? Value of wealth. Value of wealth. Now, I mentioned what wealth is. The commonwealth. Wealth. So, the collective productive capacity of society. When thinking of wealth today, even though modern economics has done away with the labor theory of value, still, when we measure the wealth of nations, wealth of countries, we measure it based on a very similar principle, which is gross domestic product, GDP, and per capita productivity, and also what's known as purchasing power parity, PPP. So, how productive is a country? How productive is its labor force? What is its per capita contribution to gross domestic product? And what can that labor buy on the world market? Purchasing power parity. So, but understood on the basis of GDP. And the basis of GDP. Generally, what this is concerned with, what these kinds of estimations are really concerned with, is how countries should improve their labor productivity, how they should better realize their productive capacities. So that's what these measures are used for. They're used for thinking about how countries could better pursue their wealth. but their wealth understood not as possessions of physical things, but rather of their productive capacity. So when we were talking about property with Rousseau, we talked about how property, especially in the polemical way that Rousseau addresses it at the beginning of part 2 of the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, that we might think of it as like things, physical possessions. But in fact, it's a social relation. It's not a physical possession. It's a social relation. And it's a social relation of labor. Meaning it's a social relation of how we're dependent on each other as laborers in a cooperative society. And that's really what Smith is going to be exploring here. So I use that word cooperative. Keep this concept in mind because Marx is going to distinguish between 3 phases of bourgeois society and capitalism, the development of bourgeois society into capitalism. And those 3 phases are cooperation, manufacture, and industry. Marx distinguishes between these in a way that Smith actually does not, meaning Smith is going to use these terms interchangeably. Smith is writing after the Industrial Revolution has already begun, but he's not fully registering its effects. In other words, he's a thinker of cooperation and manufacture. He's not really a thinker of the Industrial Revolution. And so in many respects, the issue of capitalism doesn't appear for Smith. And it's not because he's blind to it or something, but because it really hasn't manifested the problem that Marx is facing in the 1800s. So the Industrial Revolution conventionally dated, the first Industrial Revolution anyway, conventionally dated from 1750 to 1850. It's already well underway. He talks about the fire engine, by which he doesn't mean like a fire rescue vehicle or a fire suppression truck. He means a steam engine. A fire engine is a steam engine. And he also talks about the division of labor. But he talks about the division of labor in 2 different respects that Marx is going to distinguish between cooperation and manufacture. The first is the specialized division of labor. So that is the division of labor, if you've ever heard this expression, the butcher, the baker, and the brewer. It's the butcher, the baker, the brewer, and the candlestick maker. Right? So the specialized division of labor, the division of labor in which each worker is like an artisan, or each workshop at least is artisanal, and they produce the whole product. And then cooperation is the division of labor among people producing different things that they all nonetheless consume. So the butcher, the baker, the brewer, the candlestick maker. That's the specialized division of labor. Manufacture, by contrast, is the detailed division of labor. The detailed division of labor. And that's the pin factory. So Smith uses the illustration of the pin factory, the detailed division of labor, in which multiple workers are producing one thing, and they're subdividing the production process of that one thing. In the pin factory, in the case of the pin factory, it's the pin. So rather than one blacksmith making a pin, doing all the different actions of making the pin, rather that productive process is subdivided among several workers. And he talks about the kind of geometrical or even exponential increase in production that the detailed division of labor creates. He extrapolates that onto cooperation, onto the specialized division of labor. So he thinks that in the specialized division of labor, the butcher, the baker, the brewer, the candlestick maker, the blacksmith, the carpenter, the stonemason, the farmer, that specialized division of labor, each person, each artisanal handicraft really excels in their own domain. And so then when people are incentivized to exchange their goods and exchange their goods on a broader market, they get very good at making the one thing that they're specialized in. And that's how the productivity of society as a whole increases. That's quite different, though, from the way workers on an assembly line in a factory with the detailed division of labor increase their productivity by subdividing the tasks of labor. That's actually a different phenomenon. For Smith, however, they are not only analogized, but they're really identified with each other. Now, why is that important? Because it turns out that manufacturing is not just a variety of the division of labor, but it's actually setting the stage for the Industrial Revolution. Meaning, it's the factory is the site where machines can come in and automate the production process. When it's artisanal production, when it's the specialized division of labor, when it's the butcher, the baker, the brewer, the carpenter, the blacksmith, the stonemason, the farmer, what you have is scattered site production, meaning there's no way in which a machine can really replace or automate the labor process, let alone the cooperation process in that production. It's what we now call cottage industry. Cottage industry. So in early bourgeois society, what you have is what we would now call cottage industry. So you have, once the money economy becomes important, once it becomes important for people to have money to be able to buy the necessaries and conveniences of life, the subsistence goods that they need, then doing subsistence agriculture in the village is no longer enough. Meaning you have to supplement your production in order to get a money income. So what's known as cottage industry was first done by women. It was like a kind of domestic labor. So the men were farming and the women were spinning yarn or weaving. And then merchants would go and collect the product of that cottage industry and bring it to market. Eventually what happens is that those merchants traveling around collecting the produce of cottage industry decide that it'd be easier for them to gather all the workers in one place, and that's the birth of the factory. So rather than them going and collecting the scattered products of laborers working in their own cottages, they bring the workers in, pay them to produce at the factory. Now this is important because this is exactly what Smith is describing. So Smith is describing the era of manufacture, which is really the preceding era. He's living in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. He's describing his present era, but really in terms of the immediate past, say the previous 100, 150 years. And he's describing a situation in which the proprietor of stock, what he calls the proprietor of stock, is not really yet a capitalist, but is really literally the owner of stock. What does the owner of stock mean? So, by the way, they already have like shares, like you can buy shares in companies and this kind of thing, but it's not like stock like the stock market. It's not like owning stocks. Owning stock in a company is like being a shareholder. This is the proprietor of stock. What is the proprietor of stock? They are the owners of the raw materials, and they're the owners of the final product. Meaning they're owners of the stuff in the warehouse. So the proprietor of stock is essentially a merchant. And they serve as an intermediary between the workers and the market. between the producers and the consumers. So the proprietor of stock is not really, for Smith, the organizer of production, because he asks, like he talks about the wages of labor and the profits of stock, he asks, well, are the proprietors of stock contributing to production? Is it a form of labor that they're doing? And he says, no, not really. No. They're just merchants. They're just intermediaries. That's because he sees the workers themselves as organizing the detailed division of labor in the factory. Meaning all the workers are there, but as far as the proprietor of stock is concerned, they could all just be doing their own little piecework deal in the factory. And it's just convenient for them to have them all in one place so that they don't have to go around collecting the scattered produce of cottage industry. But it's the workers themselves who figure out innovations in production, such as the detailed division of labor in the assembly line in the pin factory, or who learn how to utilize and maximize the productivity of something like a machine, a fire engine, a steam engine. He talks about the little boy who finds a new way of operating the fire engine to make it more productive so that he has more free time to play with his friends. All right, it's an era of child labor. It's also an era of women laboring, because again, the men are farmers, or they are guildcraft artisans. They're not factory workers. Factory work is actually seen as feminine. It's seen as something that men shouldn't do. So it's fit for women and children, but not for men. Factory work. Guildcraft artisan work is fit for men, farming fit for men, but not factory labor. In the prevailing attitudes of the time. So it has to do with the changing character of work and labor. But for Smith, again, productivity increases due to the improvement and innovation by the workers themselves. So when we think of capitalists today, when we think of them as something other than owners of capital, like money to invest, because there's that kind of capitalist. But when we think of a capitalist as an entrepreneur, we think of someone who's an innovator in production. Someone who has like a patented way of doing things, a trade secret, intellectual property. We think of them as producers, as engineers, inventors. That's not what the proprietor of stock is for Smith at all. And that is remarkable. That's something that we should sort of recognize. Okay, so what is he talking about when he's talking about the proprietor of stock? He's not talking about a capitalist entrepreneur. He's talking about a merchant. So for him, workers are the producers. Proprietors of stock are not really producers. In a way that after the Industrial Revolution, when production technique, technology, ways of organizing production, intellectual property become so very important in production, then suddenly the capitalist becomes a kind of a glorified worker. The example that I always like to use is, from the recent history, and, these people are still kicking around, like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, like the inventors of the microcomputer. That basically they produced in their own garage or basement the microcomputer, and then they were successful, and so then they had to hire help. So they were the workers who made it, and then they had to hire other workers to help them because they themselves personally could not produce enough. So that's a very different way of thinking about the role of the proprietor as a capitalist entrepreneur, very different from the way Smith sees the proprietor of stock. All right, so when he's talking about the costs of goods, and he divides it between the wages of labor and the profits of stock, the profits of stock are merely the market profits of a merchant. what he calls buying cheap and selling dear, meaning you want to buy things for as little as possible and sell them for as much as possible. And in that respect, everyone is a merchant. Everyone, including a worker, is a merchant. Meaning everyone wants to buy things for as cheaply as possible and sell things for as much as possible. And he thinks that there's actually a danger in society succumbing to what he calls the mercantile interest. Like the short-term profit motive, he thinks undermines the long-term development of productivity in society. So there's sort of two different dynamics at work. There is short-term profiteering, the mercantile interest, but then there's the development of wealth, meaning the development of productive capacity of labor. There's the development, in his terms, of cooperation through the division of labor, because that's really what he sees as what's driving productivity. What drives productivity across hundreds and even thousands of years for Smith is the increased productivity achieved through a more specialized division of labor. So people getting very good at producing things in a more and more specialized way, and subspecialization, and the kind of interdependence that produces, that links people through market relations rather than through direct subsistence relations, as was the case in traditional civilization and in subsistence agriculture. That's pretty stagnant at the level of productivity, meaning, the Middle Ages, pretty stagnant, meaning people just maintain traditional ways of doing things, traditional ways of farming, traditional guildcraft techniques in producing things. Bourgeois society, by contrast, is a society that has a rapid increase in productivity. Now, finally, I'll say something, because I mentioned Locke and Locke's notion of property, and the main example for Locke of property is land. And I mentioned this, I think, last week, that Smith is living after the second agricultural revolution. So the first agricultural revolution is the Neolithic revolution that replaces the hunter-gatherer communities with settled agricultural civilizations. The second agricultural revolution is this bourgeois agricultural revolution, in which productivity of farming is massively increased. And we'll see what Smith has to say about that, how he thinks that happened. That's a major phenomenon that he's trying to reckon with. And then, just as a side note, we've recently, in the last 60 or 70 years, lived through what's known as the third agricultural revolution, or the green revolution. And that's artificial fertilizer and other techniques that have massively increased farming productivity. But in fact, the second agricultural revolution perhaps was even more dramatic in its increase in productivity of the land than the third has been. The first agricultural revolution is really something entirely different. It doesn't quite make sense to talk about it in terms of productivity. It has some aspects of that, but it's a kind of trading of one kind of subsistence for another. It does allow for a higher population, the first agricultural revolution, but on a meaner basis. So it allows more people, but also they're less well-nourished than hunter-gatherers are. So you have a higher population, but they're malnourished and sick. Also because they domesticate animals, and then the animal diseases are introduced into the population. So humans suffer from disease as settled agricultural civilized people in a way that they did not when they were hunter-gatherers, actually. Interesting note. And we still suffer from crossover animal to human, right, that come from civilization. That's still a major phenomenon that we experience as civilized people rather than as hunter-gatherers. All right. So that's where I wanted to start off. And let me turn to the notes that you guys posted. I know a few of you posted some notes. But that's my kind of intro. Now, we're not going to be reading Marx's Das Kapital systematically. We're going to be reading snippets of Volume 1 and Volume 3, and we're going to be reading snippets of the Grundrisse. And by snippets, I mean, pages-long sections. Now, with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and with Marx's Das Kapital, I just want to mention that Marx actually mimics Smith in certain ways. So the part that we read, the first section of The Wealth of Nations, has really two components. It has a logical component, and then it has a historical component. So he gives a kind of logical analysis, and then he gives a historical account of how this came to be. And Marx does something very similar in Volume 1 of Das Kapital. And usually this is a cause for some consternation, some dispute over which is more primary. Is the historical account more determinative, or is the logical account more determinative of what's going on? I mention that only because, of course, how can you separate history from the logic of these social relations? Because really what we're talking about is the emergence of social relations that then have a certain logic to them. But he starts with the logical and then moves back to the historical in the reading that we did for today, between Book 1 and Book 3. And actually that's the way Marx does Das Kapital. He starts logically with the commodity, and then he moves on to history, to the historical development. So we'll talk about the history in the second half of class, but let's, in the first half of class, focus on the logical aspects of his arguments of Book 1. So let's start with Julia's notes. Here, I'll share my screen with you guys.
Do you want me to speak on it?
Please do, yes.
Okay. Hold on, let me just quit out. Okay, so pretty much I wrote about kind of like how, or I didn't write, but I wanted to touch base on kind of what the reading was saying about like the difference between the growth of like manufacturing versus like agriculture, and it was just kind of explaining like the pin story, how because in like manufacturing it's easier to see in a leap in productivity because you're able to have like specific like be able to specialize in specific tasks, and so when separate people are specifically doing different tasks all at once, it's easier to see growth. But within the agricultural industry, it's a bit different, just because of seasonal dependencies within that industry. It's more difficult to be able to do that, which I found was kind of hindering in a way. But I also didn't fully understand. I don't know. I didn't fully understand it, and I also thought that made me think about kind of why there is that issue with only specializing in specific things, because you're not able to switch tasks when needed, which I think is what's needed within the agricultural industry. And then another one is kind of like seeing like kind of a growth in creativity, and how you're talking about like how the little boy wanted to play with his friends. So like there's like this need to be like creative and kind of find solutions to help with like progression. And like one quote that I found interesting, or I found two quotes interesting. So it was, those 10 persons could make among them about 12 pounds of pins a day, upward of 48,000 pins. If they had all wrought separately, they certainly could not each of them have made 20, perhaps not one pin a day. So back to like the pin story. And then this quote, the next quote was kind of more touching base on task switching. So he kind of wrote that like if people are to switch tasks and do, within that time that they switch the task, it kind of lowers productivity because they're, switching the task. So it says, a man commonly saunters a little in turning his hand from one sort of employment to another. For some time he rather trifles than applies to good purpose. This also made me think about like, never mind. I was gonna say something, but never mind. So yeah, that was pretty much what I wrote about.
Good. Let me say something about this. So I mentioned that he argues not simply that labor is the source of value in exchange, but that it should be. Now, he also makes an argument where he's advocating for compensating people, paying wages according to time. So he argues against piecework, being paid by the piece, and rather argues in favor of paying people for their time. Now, the reason for that, again, is he thinks it's sort of an incentive to greater productivity. He also thinks that it tempers burnout, so piecework might burn people out, might cause people to overwork. So he sees it as an efficiency problem, but he also sees it as the actual true value of work to people. That really the time that they spend on laboring and the time of their meeting their necessities and conveniences of life, their subsistence needs, the time of reproducing their labor, as well as the time of doing their labor, what goods are worth to them, is also a function of time. How much food do you need to eat in a day? It's a function of time. So he thinks that, generally speaking, labor should be compensated in the form of time. And that, in fact, in a kind of exchange of goods produced by labor, in an exchange between producers, they are going to generally seek to realize the value of what they've made in terms of the time it took them, and also in terms of being compensated in a way that will pay for their subsistence as a measure of time. So why is this important? Because the rhythm of agriculture is seasonal, meaning you plant the seeds, then you wait for the plants to grow, then you harvest the crop, and then you drink the fermented product of the crop in the wintertime when you can't do farming. Right? So it has a very different rhythm than daily labor. So also it's more contingent on natural conditions. So some years have good harvests and some don't. Some years there's more rain than other years. Sometimes there's a drought. So, in terms of increased productivity of agriculture, that's something that can only be measured over very long periods of time. And in fact, one of the things that he'll say about money and money value, right? Market price versus natural price. Like, he's got two different ways of talking about this. He has natural and market price as a way of thinking about this, but also, how does money reflect the market price versus the natural price of something? And he actually says that it would be better not to measure the economy based on money, but based on what he calls corn or grain. That's what he means. He doesn't mean corn like maize, from the Americas. He means grain, because grain is the main subsistence good. Like, the agricultural revolution means that we subsist on grain now, not on fruit and meat, the way we did on the paleo diet when we were Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. That now we live off of carbs, starches, grains. And he says it would be a truer measure to measure the price of goods over extended periods of time relative to the cost of grain than it would be to look at just the money price of things. Because again, what we're looking at is the cost of subsistence. He also thinks, just a side note, that one way of measuring wealth in a society is how long people live, longevity, but also infant mortality, how many children survive childhood to grow up. So he sees in his own society, over the preceding couple of hundred years, in the second agricultural revolution, he has seen a massive increase in life expectancy and a massive decrease in infant mortality. But how do you measure such things, right? How do you measure how the economy functions relative to such things? It's difficult. So clearly a lot of that has had to do with agricultural production, and yet it's harder to track the increased productivity of agricultural production than it is in something like the increased productivity of the pin factory, where that's clearly about the division of labor and mastering different aspects of production. It's a kind of microcosm of society, where in society, everyone is getting better at producing all sorts of things. Farmers are getting better at farming all different kinds of crops, but also artisans are getting better at producing all sorts of different things. Now, I mentioned The Revolt of the Third Estate, Abbé Sieyès, the French Revolutionary pamphlet. What is the Third Estate? And we talked about this earlier in the course, the bourgeois epoch, starting in the Renaissance, as the transformation of society, the transformation of production, the movement from a peasant-based, a farmer-based civilization to a worker-based society. That meant breaking up traditional ways of doing things. So it meant breaking up traditional agricultural practices. It also meant breaking up the guilds. It meant freeing workers from traditional guildcraft, monopoly on production. It meant a revolution in technique. And that's, side by side with the scientific revolution, with the revolution in inquiry. Freedom of inquiry and freedom to change and improve technique. So a technique at the level of artisanal production, handicrafts, technique at the level of farming. That's, when he's looking back at the preceding 200 years, especially in England, especially in Britain, he's looking at a massive increase in productivity due to the freedom to develop technique. And that's really happened in a commercial or market-mediated exchange society where people have had an incentive to produce more, for farmers to produce more so that they can sell it on the market, for artisans to produce more than just what the village needs for its subsistence. So there's that kind of incentive that production for the market brings, but that could only be realized. In other words, that's merely an incentive. That could only be realized through this increased productivity. And he thinks that happens through the division of labor. Let me say something just about the market. So there's always been trade, so as long as civilization has existed, like ever since the Neolithic Revolution and even in the Paleolithic era, in the era of the hunters and gatherers, there's always trade. But trade was usually for luxury goods and not subsistence goods. And trade was a much smaller part of the overall economy and production relative to the subsistence production of the community. So even though there are civilizations where a lot of production was done for trade, but again, usually it was for luxury goods or state goods, like military goods, not subsistence goods for the mass of the population. Whereas in our society, the subsistence goods for the mass of the population are produced for trade. Right, so in traditional civilization, there would be more of a bifurcation between the subsistence production of the community and its production for trade. Whereas now, very little is done for immediate consumption of producers. Very little subsistence production is done directly. Rather, the vast majority of productive activity of labor is done for exchange, for trade, for the market. So to say that production was done in traditional civilization for subsistence, it means there's no money, and there's also no real exchange at the level of a market. There isn't like supply and demand. So the farmers produce the food, the blacksmiths produce the metal implements that the farmers need to farm, the carpenters produce the wood products that the farmers need and the blacksmiths need, et cetera, et cetera. So everything is done according to custom and according to the immediate subsistence needs of the community, the village. And insofar as people produce more than for their immediate subsistence, now I'm making a very gross generalization, meaning this would apply to all civilizations everywhere, Africa, Asia, Europe, Western Hemisphere. The excess production, the production that's beyond subsistence, is for the priests and the warriors. It's for the people who don't produce at all, who are fed and clothed and housed and armed by a traditional subsistence agricultural and artisan producing community. Right, so the third estate is producing all of that stuff for the priests and the aristocrats who don't labor at all. Right, so it's not an excess of production for trade. That develops very marginally and very slowly and very exigently, meaning it's not a consistent aspect of everyday life for the vast majority of people in traditional civilization. There are moments in the history of traditional civilization that have greater periods of trade. We'll be talking about that in the second half of class today, And also, this is something that Benjamin Constant will take up in Thursday reading, about the modern society being more commercial than ancient society. But it's just something to keep in mind, because a lot of what we take for granted today just didn't apply. People didn't need money to survive. People exchanged on the basis of customary arrangements, relationships in the village. There wasn't a market. Or if there was a market, it was a very small part of economic life. In the village, where most of the population lived and where most of the productive activity was going on. Of course, there were cities in the ancient world, in traditional civilization, and there the market was more prominent. But even there, it tended to be a market in luxury goods. Or, if it was a market, it was about the exchange between the town and the countryside. Okay, so hopefully that addresses, Julia, some of the things that you were talking about. And again, he's living through the manufacturing revolution, and he is, it's ex post facto, it's in retrospect. He is living in the first decades of the Industrial Revolution. It is there in his description of empirical reality, but it isn't registered as itself a significant change in productive activity. And the reason for that is that Smith sees machines as tools. And we'll see that in capitalism, they are tools, but they're also more than tools. They're automatons. They're not just tools, but they're automatons. They're not just things that workers use, but they're things that can replace workers. Machines. All right, but that's not registering in Smith's account. Let me see something. We'll come back to, Jacqueline, to your notes, because they seem to pertain more to the second set of readings, maybe. That we had for today. The book 3. The historical account. So let me look now. Alright, so let's look at Emma and Acacia's notes. Emma, did you want to say something about your notes?
Yeah, for sure. I think some of the things that I found interesting, and this was addressed a little bit already, but was sort of about the emphasis of allocating a sole task to a person. I've worked in an environment where, I had one job that I did repetitively, and it's sort of like set up almost as an equation in that, if one person is doing one thing, there is a higher, there's more dexterity, there's higher production.
You get skilled at it.
Yeah, exactly. I think the only maybe factor that I didn't see maybe accounted for was like the sort of atrophy that happens of just like doing one thing for so long, like it just you get weary of it. And so I think that's what I was thinking about while reading it, was that like this is a, in terms of productivity, it like I've definitely seen this in action and that it works, but there's only so much that you can, I mean
there's a downside.
Yeah, exactly. And this is an individual sort of question, but how fulfilled can one person feel doing one thing for, presumably for a very long amount of time?
That's right. So if I might, I will say hold that thought till tomorrow.
Okay.
Because he is gonna turn around and say that what he says is that the division of labor makes people as narrow and stunted as is humanly possible.
Yeah.
Right, and he means
Yeah.
that not merely in terms of like a member of a detailed division of labor assembly line kind of work. He
Yeah.
also means professionals. Like
Yeah,
being a
absolutely.
lawyer or a doctor or a dentist or a college professor, like, might narrow you
Yeah.
and stunt you.
Or even being an artist. Like,
Mhm.
I practice so many different things because I get really tired of doing one thing all the time, and I need to stretch my legs and figure something else out.
Absolutely. And we're going to see that in the discussion of education tomorrow night. So he has like a humanistic, like, and also classical kind of notion of education. It's what we would now call the Renaissance man.
Okay.
Right, so the idea, it's from ancient Greece, the idea that, like, the well-rounded person. So on education, we'll see that he thinks that people should be mentally educated, physically educated, militarily educated, that they should be educated in a well-rounded way. And he also, we will see, he thinks adult continuing education is necessary. To compensate for, to make up for the division of labor specialization.
Yeah. The phrase also jack of all trades kept going through my head.
Jack
while
of
I
all
was reading
trades,
this.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, and which is an
Yeah.
ideal of the bourgeois epoch for sure.
Yeah.
I always like to point out, so there are two, I think it's the same author, Defoe, who writes Robinson Crusoe and Moll Flanders.
Okay.
Let me see if Defoe wrote Moll Flanders. Hold on. But these are the great novels of the time. Daniel Defoe. Yeah. And so she is someone who has to. So he also writes Robinson Crusoe. So anyway, Moll Flanders, though, the story of Moll Flanders is about a woman who has to constantly reinvent herself.
Right.
Because she's sort of on the run, and so she's changing identities, and, and it's a kind of a notion of, like, bourgeois heroism.
Sure.
That one be capable of this, that one be capable of reinventing oneself and of learning to do different things. And so the Robinson Crusoe story is related, and we'll see what Marx has to say about this also. Because he calls bourgeois thought a Robinsonade, meaning like Robinson Crusoe, which is that someone is cast away from society, but then just by themselves they reproduce society.
Right.
Because they set themselves to task and organize their labor, and they have to do all the different things.
Almost like a division of cells.
Yes, they have to.
Yeah.
They have to do they have to personally do a division of labor on their own.
Right. Absolutely.
Right, and again, that this is like a heroic ideal, and yet it cuts against the reality of bourgeois society, which is this narrow specialization.
Yeah. Right.
And the kind of deforming of the individual through, or kind of stunting of the individual through that specialization. So he's going to see the role of education as ameliorating that, as mitigating against that, as compensating for that. And again, it's the sort of healthy mind, healthy body, like, it's very Hellenistic, like ancient Greece, especially Athenian notion, and, Aristotelian, like moderation in all things,
Sure.
The well-rounded personality. And as realized through the Renaissance humanistic ideal. And that is very much the case for Smith. And we'll also recall from last week, Rousseau was also talking about how, in comparison to the Paleolithic peoples, the hunter-gatherers, the noble savage, that civilized people are stunted and deformed, and it's through the specific roles that they play in society.
Yeah.
In other words, they're formed and deformed by being members of an elaborate civilization. And Rousseau also talked about the division of labor as a function of interdependency, which he was problematizing and criticizing in comparison to the state of nature, right? Where the human being is a kind of whole, solitary, integral being, whereas we lose that as members of society.
Sure, yeah.
Especially as members of developed civilization. Yes, so we will see this is actually important to Smith. But initially he's talking about first the increased capacity to support human beings.
Right. Yeah. And even surpass just supporting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, the necessaries and conveniences of life.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Acacia, would you like to?
Sure. Yeah, it's just more of the same of what Emma and Julia have already spoken about and that you've already spoken about. But I'll just add that my agreement that in my work life, I've noticed this as well, that if you focus on a singular task, it seems to go faster rather than jumping around, and your brain has to like switch modes to get into a different task. So if you're working on a team project, I feel like about getting an assembly line going. It's just something that happens, which is interesting that we work that way. And I also thought it was interesting that Smith said something about the way we trifle about before starting a different task, which I don't understand why, but that's so true. I think that that's absolutely something that at least I do. So I just thought that was interesting.
Right, so there's a kind of dual human nature, we might say. You know, are humans naturally productive and inventive and creative? Yes. Are they naturally lazy? Yes.
Of course.
Right? So, you know, it's not one or the other. It's really both, and then it's all very contextual. It's very context dependent, which side of our nature comes out. And also that they're related, that we might be more productive so that we can be more lazy.
And it's absolutely true that we get bored of doing the one thing, and there are things that we prefer over others.
Absolutely. So, you know, and again, he's talking about how these things are socially conditioned. That, you know, the context is not just individual, it's not just circumstantial, and it's not just sort of natural or physiological, but really the most important context for all of this is society. Meaning, what are the social conditions for our activity? You know, which is a complex thing to consider, and so he's got to find some ingenious way of cutting through to the essence of what would otherwise seem very circumstantial and really get at something that's much more conceivable in terms of society and how it develops and how it creates conditions for labor. All right, let's take a short break and then we'll come back and look at the history side of things. Okay, let's resume. All right, so I wanted to just give some further background on the history that he's going to be addressing. I don't know how familiar you guys are with this history, but I'll assume that you have some familiarity with it. So he's writing in the 1700s. As we were talking about in the first half of class, He's writing at a time where bourgeois society had been developing for several hundred years already. So we're going to see, this is going to be important for Marx, that bourgeois society is only truly recognized in its own terms when it is fully developed. Meaning and we'll see that Hegel uses the phrase, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, that consciousness, knowledge comes post festum, comes after the fact. So it's ex post facto, it's retrospective in nature. That bourgeois society doesn't understand itself in its own terms. It understands itself in terms of classical antiquity and Christianity until the 18th century, until the 1700s, until this period of time, until people like Locke and Rousseau and Smith and Kant and Hegel. So he's going all the way back, however, looking at European civilization as an outgrowth of classical antiquity. So-called Western civilization, which is not really a concept in the 1700s. That's much more of a concept of the 1800s. It's a concept of the capitalist era more than of the bourgeois era. We'll see how that's important. Nonetheless, so ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the ancient Mediterranean world, the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, because we'll see the Roman Republic is actually centrally important, and then the Roman Empire as the height of that classical antiquity, the height of that ancient Mediterranean world, followed by the fall of the Roman civilization into the so-called Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the medieval era. And he's interested in how bourgeois society emerged out of the medieval era. So how the medieval era represented a step down from classical antiquity, but also how things picked up again in the late Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, and producing bourgeois society. Now, a common way of thinking about these things in Smith's time, and he is also part of this, is to think that bourgeois society was resuming classical antiquity. In other words, that it's linking back up with the achievements of classical antiquity around or over and above the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages are this kind of interregnum. Now we will also see, when we get into the reading tomorrow night on colonization, there's also the question of classical antiquity itself. Meaning, if European civilization is the outgrowth of Roman civilization, of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, that indeed that also has its downsides. So there is a distinction between ancient Greece and ancient Rome, ancient Athens especially, and ancient Rome. This is something that Benjamin Constant will address on Thursday, about, well, what is our model from classical antiquity? When we think of the ancients, what are we thinking of? Are we thinking of Athens or are we thinking of Rome? He's going to distinguish, Smith, tomorrow night, two different patterns of colonization, the Greek model and the Roman model. And he's going to contrast them. Not just compare them, but contrast them. An idea that people had in the 1700s was a kind of counterfactual history, a kind of if history had taken a different turn idea. Now, if you know your ancient Roman history, Carthage is the great enemy of Rome. So, Rome defeats Carthage, but after a titanic struggle, and Hannibal tries to defeat Rome by invading Europe and crossing over the Alps with an army equipped with elephants, famously, but he loses. And Rome defeats Carthage and completely destroys Carthage, razes it to the ground, salts the earth so that people can't grow anything there, really completely annihilates Carthage. There is an idea in the 1700s, however, in this bourgeois era of enlightenment, that perhaps things would have turned out differently and turned out better if Carthage had won instead of Rome. The reason for that is that Carthage was actually a more commercial civilization than Rome. Rome was really based, even the Roman Republic, not just the Roman Empire, but the Roman Republic was based on a much more traditional, conventional, typical model of civilization, which is a civilization of conquest. That it grows and develops through conquest. Carthage, on the other hand, was a trading civilization. And so in the 1700s, there was this idea that maybe history would have turned out better, and we could have skipped over a lot of unnecessary drama and suffering if Carthage had won over Rome. And therefore, the Roman legacy in European civilization is problematical. So the way medieval Europe comes out of the fall of Roman civilization, that Rome left a legacy that actually held Europe back. And that a new principle had to emerge in order for bourgeois society to develop. Hegel, in the reading that we'll do for Monday next week, is going to talk about it in the sense of the Germanization of the Roman Empire. Meaning the late Roman Empire is a period in which they're fighting the German tribes, but they have some German tribes as allies and other German tribes as adversaries. And ultimately, the Germans defeat the Romans, but also Roman civilization is inherited by the Germans and Germanized. And so Hegel will attribute the German contribution to Roman civilization and the aftermath of Roman civilization, an important component of bourgeois society, of laying the seeds for creating the potential for bourgeois society. And we'll see, because in fact, Smith is already articulating this, and Hegel's just picking up a lot, not only from Smith, but from the greater Enlightenment view of these things. So the difference between a slave and a serf. So serf just means slave, and yet the serfs actually had a different status than the slaves. The serfs of the Middle Ages have a different status than the slaves of ancient Rome. And again, we'll talk about this more tomorrow because we'll talk about the plantation economy of the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, and how that's replicated by the European colonists in the Western Hemisphere and also elsewhere. So the plantation economy, which is farming by slaves versus farming by serfs in the medieval village, in the traditional village of medieval Europe. And so there's a kind of Germanization of Christianity as well, where the status of the serf is due to traditional German tribal practices, but also due to, or justified through, a kind of Christian theology. We'll talk about that more on Monday of next week when we read Hegel. But again, Hegel is getting it from the preceding Enlightenment thought about what made bourgeois society possible. So this is what Smith is going over in his treatment of this history. So on the one hand, he wants to say that there is a natural propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. So there is something in human nature, Smith thinks, that leads to bourgeois society. And again, this is something that can be seen in the Paleolithic peoples, in the noble savages, in the hunting and gathering communities, because they also have trade and commerce. They also have other things. They have slavery too, because they also war against each other and conquer each other and exterminate each other, but also enslave each other. But it's different from the slavery of civilization. So the natural propensity to truck, barter, and exchange is there, but it comes out more or less based on societal conditions and history. So it isn't just a given. It's a potential, but it's not always realized. And often it's not realized. Although he understands the kind of cooperative division of labor in the subsistence agricultural village as a kind of propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. So he does see the division of labor as an exchange relationship. Now, why this is important is that actually Marx is going to point out that the specialized division of labor is an exchange relationship, but the detailed division of labor is not an exchange relationship. Meaning the workers on the assembly line of the pin factory are not engaged in exchange with each other. The way the butcher, the baker, the brewer, the candlestick maker, the blacksmith, the carpenter, the stonemason, the farmer are exchanging with each other. That their social cooperation, their cooperative production is a function of exchange across the division of labor. But the detailed division of labor is not an exchange relation. Because really what the workers in the pin factory, they form one worker together. It's a kind of combined choreography in which multiple human beings are really functioning as one worker. That's different. It's not an exchange relation between those workers in the pin factory. Okay, but anyway, the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange can explain social cooperation, especially the specialized division of labor. And again, that could be understood also as exchange between communities. And indeed, in the village, one could say that there is already an exchange between communities, meaning there's the community of farmers, there's the community of artisans. So not just geographical communities, but also specialized production communities within the same geographical location. So that's an important kind of aspect of things, this natural propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, but it's not always realized. So it really depends on, again, political economy. What is the economy of the polis? The polis being the community created by the zoon politikon. So what kind of a community have people created culturally? What kind of polis do they inhabit together? And that varies. That varies a great deal across different times and places. And sometimes it creates conditions that are more conducive to increasing productivity, and sometimes it does not. Now you'll notice one of the things that he takes up is this question of what he calls the discouragement of agriculture in the ancient state of Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, it's an interesting thing that he does here in terms of land as property. So land as property, he talks about the Roman rule of primogeniture, which is taken over by the feudal system. So what that means is that the land is not divided among the children, but is given wholly to the first child. So primogeniture. Now, what does that refer to? Well, of course, that refers to the manorial estate. That refers to the eldest son, or if there is no eldest son, the eldest daughter, inheriting the title of the manorial estate. So it's about the dynastic character of feudal lords. Feudal property is different from bourgeois property. But what he's saying is this discourages increased productivity. Whereas if the property were divided, then people would have to do more with less. So it wouldn't be as stagnant. It wouldn't just be about keeping the same thing going, maintaining the subsistence of the manorial estate in the feudal arrangement. Now, that doesn't apply to the peasants. In other words, the peasant families, they tend to work on commons, meaning on common land. And then if there is land that's held by particular families, plots, yes, it stays in the family, it's in a condition of primogeniture, but it's like a miniature version of the way the title of the landed estate of the feudal lord of the aristocracy is structured. So he really lays the responsibility for this property structure and how it inhibits agricultural production on the way that the feudal system arises out of the Roman system. So the Roman system is the Knights of Rome, and again, we'll talk about this tomorrow night with colonization. So warriors in the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire are rewarded for their conquests by being given rights to the land to have a plantation. But that plantation is really, we'll talk about this more tomorrow night, to produce tribute for Rome itself. In other words, you're producing in order to send back to Rome. You are having to produce to maintain the subsistence of the plantation, but you're also meant to produce to send back to Rome as tribute. And that you get a cut of that, and that's your reward, that's your benefit from being a warrior, from being part of the citizenry of Rome. When the Roman Empire collapses, these plantations become kind of the basis for the manorial estates of feudalism. The lord of the manor, the feudal lord. Again, as modified by the fact that this is taken over by the Germans and by German tribal chiefs and by the warrior caste among the German tribes. So the conquest of Roman civilization by the Germans that establishes the feudal aristocracy. The Knights of Rome. The Knights of Rome. As the basic unit of the feudal system. So he thinks that property system and that principle of primogeniture is responsible for keeping Europe stagnant in its agricultural production through the Middle Ages. In a way that was not the case in classical antiquity. So in classical antiquity, there was an incentivization to produce in the plantation to increase agricultural production as tribute. And, also to support the metropole, the metropolitan city, the Roman city-state, but also its ability to maintain its empire, to maintain and expand its conquests. That isn't what's going on in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, things are just being kept as they are. Things are just being maintained. And part of it has to do with Christendom and Christianity itself. Meaning, unlike Rome, Christianity actually does not have this conquering spirit to it. Like, the goal of Christianity is not to expand, at least not in the Middle Ages. Things change with the Renaissance, with the emergence of bourgeois society, and with the bourgeois colonial era. So medieval Europe was not colonizing. It was not expanding, it was not colonizing. That changes later. So it's not as dynamic. It's not growing in the way that the civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean world of classical antiquity did grow and develop, did become more productive, did expand their population, did enhance their subsistence level. Okay, so he has a medieval discussion, then he has the discussion of the emergence of bourgeois society, which he calls the rise and progress of cities and towns after the fall of the Roman Empire. And then finally, how the commerce of the towns contributed to the improvement of the country. Meaning how the activity of the town made possible, incentivized, but also made possible at a practical level, this second agricultural revolution that bourgeois society engenders. Okay, so I think that we talked about how bourgeois means urban. It's the French word, it means town, urban. So the burghers are the town dwellers, the burgesses are the town dwellers. Bourgeois means city folk, it means town folk, city dweller, town people. Now, there are towns in the Middle Ages, there are cities. But they take on a new character in the bourgeois era. They take on a new character in the Renaissance, whether the Northern or Southern Renaissance, whether the Hanseatic League or the Italian Renaissance. So what were cities in traditional civilization? They are administrative centers. So they're centers of religion. They're political centers. They're also military centers. So they're administrative in character in all sorts of ways. What they aren't are centers of production. The center of production is the countryside. Now, towns are centers of trade, but that's because they're not producing anything. And so they have to use their administrative capacity to facilitate getting their subsistence needs met. And so they are centers of trade. The question is, when do they become centers of production? Meaning, when does trade become the motivation for production itself, where it's not just skimming off the top of a stagnant subsistence agricultural production, but is actually participating in changing that agricultural production. All right, so these things go hand in hand. Now, what I'll say about, we've mentioned the American Revolution in the context of the 7 Years' War, the rise of Britain at the expense of France in the 1700s. How did these new towns and cities and their new status, how did that happen coming out of the feudal system? Because Smith talks about how if cities or towns become wealthy, they just become vulnerable to being pillaged by the feudal lords, to being raided, sacked. So they have to learn to defend themselves. They also have to make alliances with the kings, with the monarchs. And this is where absolutism comes from. This is where the absolute monarchy comes from. So the alliance that's made between the monarchs and the bourgeoisie, or the town dwellers, of these new city-states, these new towns, new cities that have this commercial and productive character, is as against both the feudal aristocracy and the church. So there's an alliance that's made in which the monarch puts themselves above the entire system, above the aristocracy, and also eventually above the church. And this is part of the Protestant revolt and a refoundation, the reformation of Christianity to break the power of the centralized authority of the Catholic Church, the Roman Church. So this is the story that Adam Smith lays out for us. How did bourgeois society, how did the new urban society of the new bourgeois modern towns and cities of trade and commerce and production for trade and commerce, how did this happen? What were the conditions under which it took place? Especially the political conditions. How did it get the upper hand over the feudal system that had prevailed throughout the Middle Ages? And part of it is also to do with the changing character of agriculture itself. And we'll see that Marx addresses this as well in terms of the conversion of the titled aristocratic property of the manorial estates, the conversion of that into fungible private property. So the peasants were tied to the land, they weren't allowed to leave the village. Feudal lords could not sell their land. It wasn't fungible property. They were tied to the land as well. In Smith's account, who populates the new modern towns and cities, the new bourgeois city-states, free cities, free towns of Europe? Runaway slaves. People who ran away from the countryside. Serfs who were escaping the village. Right, that's part of the story. So people who were bound by custom, by birth, to the land, whether in terms of feudal aristocrats or in terms of peasant farmers, they're tied to the land. They have to be able to break that arrangement in order for bourgeois society to fully develop. And so there's a bourgeoisification of the countryside. There's a conversion. There's a transformation of the third estate. There's a transformation of the commoners. We talked about the breaking of the power of the artisan guilds and how they limited production by maintaining traditional technique and stymieing innovation. Well, it also is a transformation of agricultural property, of farmland, and a change in status of the farmers. So they go from being traditional subsistence peasants and serfs under feudal lords on manorial estates to being bourgeois farmers, to being independent family farmers, who then are able to claim the land as their own, as private property. Now, there's also a bourgeoisification of the aristocracy. That's also part of the story, where they convert their land into private property. And there's a conflict between the peasants and the feudal lords over that. But again, as impacted by the activity going on in the town, the commercial activity in the town, and the production going on in the town. So the trade and commerce and the production for trade and commerce going on in the town all contribute to this. All right, so let me turn to the notes. I think that we have, let me just see if anyone else has posted any notes. No, okay. So I think, Jacqueline, your notes maybe address some of this?
Yeah.
Let me share my screen.
So, the first one is... Oh yeah, the first one is a bit of like a question. So, basically when he's comparing like the relation to a European prince and a frugal peasant, and then the African king and the 10,000 naked savages. And so basically I was just confused as to whether he's looking at them as like two different entities and saying that the wealth is relative to where they are and like their society and their culture, or if they're he's comparing the two against each other, if that makes sense.
Well, he is. So, okay, so let's talk about this. So, you could have impoverished nobility. Often you did. In other words, you had aristocrats living in castles that were falling apart. Right, so, in other words, being a prince, being a feudal lord, doesn't mean having a great deal of material wealth. It doesn't. So it's really your status. You're the warrior in charge of defending the realm in your corner of things. And so, if you guys have seen the movie The Seven Samurai, right? So who are the samurai? They're the feudal warriors of Japan, right? So the Seven Samurai, it's about the obligation of the samurai to protect the peasants, right? It's about the mutual obligation of the peasants and the nobility, the warrior caste. Meaning the peasants are obligated to feed them, and the feudal lords are obligated to fight for them, to protect them. But that says nothing about the wealth of the community. Meaning you could have poor peasants and poor aristocrats, you could have wealthy aristocrats and poor peasants. You could have wealthy peasants and poor aristocrats. So what he's talking about is really how, the natural progress of opulence, the natural progress of wealth. He thinks if people are left to their own devices with the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, they will increase their wealth over a long period of time. So he's making a sort of a basic point. Like, what had to have changed in Europe such that a ordinary worker in England is wealthier than a king in Africa? Meaning has a higher level of subsistence, has more access to more goods. Just at the level of consumption. and that really has nothing to do with the status of the African king, like whether the African king has many subjects or few subjects. That's not really it. It's part of his argument against the physiocrats. So the physiocrats, they think, okay, a prince, a king, a chief is going to be wealthier, more powerful, if they control more land and have more subjects, if they have more people under them, controlling more natural resources. But that's not necessarily true. So Smith is saying, well, no, that really isn't. And so that's the comparison that he's making.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So,
Thanks.
yeah. But I don't know what else you wanted to say about that. So, because he is saying that it's really social conditions, it's not natural conditions that's determining these things.
I think I also forget that just like the people who are in the feudal system don't necessarily, they're not necessarily wealthy, and that kind of went over my head because I picture them kind of being granted, land from a system in order to benefit them, but it doesn't always mean that it's equates to wealth.
That's right. So it really depends on all sorts of things. Now, of course, the feudal lords, they'll try to acquire things, but mostly through conquest. They'll raid, they'll plunder. They're warriors, this is what they do. Right? But there are limits to that. And they'll raid each other. They'll steal things from each other. There's only so much they can get out of the peasants and out of the artisans. So if they want gold, they're not going to find much gold among the peasants and the artisans. So they're going to have to raid other feudal lords. Or they're going to have to raid merchant caravans. Their ability to acquire wealth in that sense is limited. It does correlate, obviously, if they control larger territory, then of course they're more likely. But again, he's making an argument about wealth in general in society, that it's not a function of natural resources, land, population, but it's really a function of productivity of labor.
Sure. For the second point here, this is, I don't know, could lead to an interesting discussion, but essentially I feel like in the past several decades, in America at least, like we've been encouraged to kind of be a jack of all trades and to almost be a generalist, to, just kind of to get a degree and get the piece of paper, and then you'll figure out your career afterwards. And I feel like with that, there's just so many people now and a market that is just saturated with people who are in comms and marketing and PR, and we're kind of lacking those specializations, and I think the pendulum swinging. So that's kind of one idea, but then the other idea is that just some of the brightest minds now are kind of thought to quote unquote sell out, meaning someone who could be practicing as a surgeon is actually going to go work for Barclays because it's more profitable to them to do something in the world market, in the stock exchange. So I think we're kind of at a really interesting turning point. And then thinking about how that is relating to what Smith is saying, I don't know. It's interesting to me. I was just trying to bring a modern parallel.
No, that's right. So right. So I mean, it's curious because there are some things that Smith would have to say about that, but then there are sort of specific capitalist distortions that we're dealing with, that have, skewed things in a way that might surprise him or might not surprise him. So one way of thinking about it is how the mercantile interest has predominated. So something that we didn't talk about in the first half of class, but that's actually quite important, is that in Smith's view, the best conditions for increasing productivity is a high wage and low profit circumstance. So he thinks that if workers are paid more, and if the proprietors of stock have a lower profit rate, that it actually forces them to reinvest in production rather than consume their profits. And that generally this will increase the wealth of society overall. And really, the proprietors of stock will profit more in the long term if they accept lower short-term profits. Whereas if they insist on higher short-term profits, it will work to everyone's detriment. So you could say that the society we've been living in the last 50 years has been a short-term profit-oriented society that has worked against the development of general productivity and general societal wealth. So from Smith's perspective, how would he be critical of the society we're living in now? He would say the mercantile interest has predominated too much. And short-term profit has overruled the development of social productivity and overall societal wealth. That it has undercut the productivity and social cooperation in the division of labor. So in Smith's view, everyone in society is a merchant, everyone is a worker, is a producer, and a consumer. But that if the merchant side of things is too predominant, it's detrimental. So there is a Smithian critique of capitalism, and especially of, modern contemporary capitalism, financialized capitalism, short-term profit turnover type capitalism that we're used to. There is a Smithian critique of that to be made, because this has been a period of high profits and low wages, as opposed to what he considered to be ideal, which is high wages and low profits. It's also why there's a lot of nostalgia for the middle 20th century, the period after World War II, before the neoliberal era that started in the 70s, because that was historically a period of high wages and low profits. Whereas the last period that we've been in, the last 50 years, has been a period of high profits and low wages by comparison. And it has really screwed things up from a Smith perspective. Now, what we're going to see is that that's not just due to wrong choices or allowing one aspect of things, the mercantile interest, to prevail. That's also due to the needs of capitalism itself, that things have taken that turn. Because Marx is going to see an inherent tendency of capitalism to move in this direction, as opposed to what Smith thought was ideal and what he was advocating. There is something in industrial production, capitalism, that skews things in this way. So it can't only be understood as mercantilism or as profiteering, although that can explain a lot. There is a criticism that one can have on that basis. But actually, it's not the real reason why things are going that way. But we'll get there when we get to Marx. Does that?
So Smith is anti-merchant to a certain degree.
Yeah. And
we could think of merchants almost in our modern day society as like middlemen.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that they're skimming off the top, right? That they're profiteering.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. So what you were saying, that people would go into Wall Street rather than go into medicine.
Mm-hmm.
right? That's exactly what you're describing, right?
Sure.
And so there's a lot of money to be made, profit to be had if you go into the stock market rather than contributing to the world of labor and production and the development of like skills and, you know, and talents. But again, the question is, how did that happen, right? And from Smith's mind, there are these competing kind of principles or imperatives, and it's not, because that makes it more like a kind of an ethical choice and also like a cultural matter. We're going to see that actually the problem of capitalism is not just that. Right. So, you know, a lot of, in our politics today, like there is a lot of like Protestant work ethic kind of critique of like the Wall Street dominated neoliberal capitalism. Like the kind of like conservative, like populist, like Trumpian kind of idea of like, you know, the workers have been shafted by Wall Street. It's a very Adam Smith kind of based perspective in this way. It's a very kind of old-fashioned bourgeois, right? People should be rewarded for their work, you know, but no, we've just gone in for like speculation and finance and profiteering.
Okay, that makes sense.
That would be a Smithian critique.
Okay. And then the last point here, pretty simple, but I was just thinking how he was saying how, like, civilizations that were on bodies of water and would just exchange within themselves actually found success in that, especially like Egyptian civilizations, what have you. And then recently, I've just been thinking a lot about like the repercussions that we're seeing now with becoming a global economy. And obviously there's like so many pros, but there are some consequences as well, just like diseases and also like offshoring work and workers' rights and all of that stuff. So yeah.
Yep. Right. So part of what he's getting to, there's like more to it in the sense that, you know, again, it's hard for us to appreciate. So Rome had roads. Rome did have roads, but medieval Europe did not. But even when there were roads, transport on water was much, much faster than transport over land. And transport over land only really becomes fast with like railroads in the industrial era. Otherwise, transport over land is slow. So water transport is essential. And really it has to do with the relationship of space and time. Meaning, the world is being connected in Smith's view via water transportation. And that's bringing people together, and it's changing the temporal rhythm of society. It's changing the temporal rhythm of production. That in the Middle Ages, one of the reasons why people aren't trading very much is because they're geographically isolated. They're land-bound. And a lot of it is overland transportation as opposed to seaborne transportation. It's the Silk Road, which is super slow. It's important. Culturally, it links different civilizations. It links Europe and the Muslim world and India and China. But the rhythm of it is so slow, you know, that it really does not impact local production very much. It's certainly not impacting it as intensively or as quickly as becomes the case. So he's trying to get the reader to think about space and time. And the thing with bourgeois society, with the new urban, like the city-states, the free city-states, like the Northern and Southern Renaissance, is that they're really, those city-states are more connected to each other over water than they're connected to their immediate countryside over land. And it is a function of ease and speed of transportation. So the people who are connected via water are more developing in common through trade and exchange relations than those cities are developing in tandem with their geographically closer but really more remote communities in the countryside. That's the point that he's making. Because again, it just changes how one thinks about things. Because if you have a kind of a excessively local, like, kind of land view of how what he calls nations develop and the wealth of nations develops, it also has to do with England. So it has to do with England being an island and having to trade out of necessity. So ocean trade, but also that a great deal of internal trade is facilitated by waterways in England as well. That this is part of what facilitates this increased productivity. Right, but again, we might take for granted in a way that we shouldn't, in his view, space and time as factors, and just how space is traversed in terms of time. And bourgeois time and space, this is something that we're going to get into when we get into Marx and also later with Lukács. We live more in homogeneous space and homogeneous time, meaning there's a way that the ideal of space and time from like a bourgeois perspective of trade and commerce is this instantaneous transportation that we have now, where basically you can get anywhere in the world within a day due to jet travel. That, again, that was neither necessary nor possible nor something that would really have been desired in a traditional agricultural civilization. It didn't have the same relationship to either space or time. So in a cosmological sense, bourgeois society is a changed temporal and spatial reality for people. And as a civilizational matter, people become connected to people around the world as a function of these trade relations in a way that wasn't the case previously. Again, in agricultural civilization, it's just not the case. In terms of ordinary people, everyday people, in terms of subsistence conditions, again, the necessaries and conveniences of life for the vast majority of people. Because that's really what bourgeois society represents. Now, everyone in the world, almost everyone, is really dependent on this new relationship of space and time and instantaneous transportation just to have our everyday needs met. All right, I think that we're coming up on time. All right, so we'll adjourn for tonight and come back and read the second part of Smith tomorrow on colonies and education and other expenses of the sovereign. Okay, so have a good night. See you guys tomorrow.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.